There are songs in the fabric of creation that mortals cannot hear. Some call them the turning of spheres, others the breath of gods, and a few who have listened long enough know them as the music, the great theme sung at the dawn of all things when the world was young and possibility itself had voice. Middle-earth was wrought from such a song shaped note by note in the halls beyond time, and every mountain, every river, every living creature carries within it an echo of that first symphony. But on a day when autumn had just begun to paint the leaves of Rivendell in shades of gold and crimson, something came to Middle-earth that had never been part of the music. Not a discordant note, for discord implies a relationship to harmony. This was something else entirely, a presence that stood outside the composition altogether, like a listener who had wandered onto the stage. He appeared first as a disturbance in the air itself, a wrongness so subtle that only those whose perceptions stretched beyond the mortal realm could sense it. Elrond felt it as he walked the gardens of Imladris, a peculiar stillness that made even the eternal voices of the Bruinen fall silent for the span of a heartbeat. Gandalf, miles away on the road from the Shire, stopped mid-stride and lifted his head as though catching a scent on the wind, not of smoke or storm, but of something that simply should not be. The stranger did not arrive with thunder or flame. There was no tearing of the sky, no opening of gates between worlds. He was simply there, standing in the courtyard of Rivendell, as though he had always been part of its stones and shadows. Tall and lean, his bearing spoke not of warriors who had won their stance through battle, but of one who had stood before thrones so ancient that kingdoms were footnotes in their memory. His face held a beauty that was ageless and cold, the kind that suggested he had seen the birth of stars and found them unremarkable. His hair fell pale as winter sunlight to his shoulders, and he wore robes of dark gray that bore no mark, no sigil, no ornament to declare allegiance or origin. When elves passed him in the corridors, they found their steps faltering, for his presence felt like standing before a door that should not exist, one that led to places the music had never touched. Those who dared meet his eyes saw something that made them look away. Not cruelty, nor madness, nor even the cold malice that Sauron's servants carried like a brand. What they saw was clarity, the gaze of one who had looked at the foundations of existence and found them wanting. His eyes held the terrible calm of someone who had measured infinity and refused to be impressed. Lucifer Morningstar had come to Middle-earth. He had not intended this journey. The Morningstar's path, if it could be called such, had been one of deliberate separation from hell, which he had ruled and then abandoned. From heaven, whose grand design he had rejected. From every role and expectation that creation had prepared for him. He had sought not power, but its opposite, the absence of obligation, the freedom to exist without purpose or prophecy demanding his compliance. Yet even in his wandering through the spaces between realities, something had pulled at his attention. Not pulled that suggested force and force could be resisted. This was subtler, a resonance perhaps, a frequency that his very nature could not ignore. He had felt it as a musician might feel a note played just slightly wrong, not in the sound itself, but in the silence that followed. Somewhere in a corner of existence he had never bothered to examine, there was a world built entirely on a foundation of music, on the idea that all creation flowed from a single perfect theme. And woven through that world like threads of gold and shadow was something that disturbed him more than any tyranny. He had witnessed the question of whether the creatures living there truly chose their fates, or merely performed roles written into the song before their first breath. The music of the Ainur. The theme of Eru Ilúvatar. A cosmos where even rebellion had been anticipated, where every discord had been woven into greater harmony, where the very act of defiance became another verse in an eternal hymn. was, in its way, beautiful. It was also a prison. Lucifer had not broken into this world. He could have the walls between realities meant little to one who had shaped creation itself in another cosmos, but force would have made him a conqueror, and he had long since tired of that role. Instead, he had waited at the boundary of art patient as stone, until the music itself made space for him. For that was the peculiar nature of Middle-earth. It was a world where the grand design could accommodate even that which had not been planned. Gandalf had arrived when hope seemed lost. Bilbo had found the ring by what seemed mere chance. The free peoples had been granted the gift of uncertain fate of roads that forked in ways the music had shaped but not dictated. And so when the stranger stood at the threshold of E, the great song that was the world did not reject him. It made room. Not as harmony welcomes a new instrument, but as a vast and ancient composition might acknowledge the presence of a listener who had finally chosen to attend. Yet even in that moment of crossing, Lucifer had felt the weight of what this world demanded. To exist here meant to exist within the music, to let his actions ripple through its themes, whether he willed it or not. He could not be merely himself. He would become part of the pattern, another thread in the tapestry, another note in the endless song. So he had made a choice, the kind of choice that defined him. He had limited himself. Not from fear, nor from courtesy to powers he did not acknowledge. He did it because to enter this world with his full capacity would mean becoming what he had always refused to be, a dominating force. A power that reshaped reality to its will. He would not bend Middle-earth to his design, for that would make him no different from the Dark Lord whose shadow crept across these lands. He would not rule here. He would not save it. He would not even guide its peoples toward their salvation. He would do only one thing: ensure that when the people of Middle-earth made their choices, they made them freely. Truly freely. Not as notes compelled by the composition, not as servants driven by fear, but as beings who held their fates in their own hands. And if that meant standing against both the tyranny of Sauron and the grand design of Eru Ilúvatar itself, then so be it. The elves of Rivendell did not know what to make of him. He spoke seldom, and when he did, his words carried a weight that seemed to pull at the very air. He made no demands, took no seat at their councils, claimed no authority. He simply was present and patient, like a question that had taken physical form. Elrond, who had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms, who had stood beside the mightiest warriors and the wisest counselors, found himself uncertain. The stranger bore no mark of evil. Indeed, he seemed to regard the very concept with something between amusement and contempt. Yet neither did he carry the bearing of the valor's servants, those who came bearing the light of the West and the certainty of purpose. When Gandalf finally arrived at Rivendell and saw the stranger standing in the Hall of Fire, the gray wizard's eyes narrowed. He approached slowly, the staff in hand, and for a long moment the two regarded each other in silence. "You are not of this world," Gandalf said at last, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "No," the stranger replied. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it held an edge like a blade testing stone. "I am not." "Then why have you come?" The stranger Lucifer turned his gaze toward the western windows, where the last light of evening painted the mountains in shades of amber and shadow. When he spoke again, his words seemed to fall into the silence like stones into deep water. To see if the music allows for anything the composer did not write. Gandalf's grip on his staff tightened. "That is a dangerous question, stranger." "Perhaps," Lucifer said. "But I have never been afraid of dangerous questions, only of answers accepted without asking them." And with that, the stranger who had borrowed a note from the music of Arda, took his place in the growing darkness, waiting for the moment when choice and destiny would meet, and when he would ensure that between the two, choice would not be drowned in the song. The Council of Elrond convened on the 25th day of October, in the year 3018 of the Third Age. Though few who gathered in that high chamber knew how the paths of the world would turn before the sun set that day. The morning had come clear and cold, with frost still clinging to the shadows where the light had not yet reached. In the Hall of Fire, representatives of the free peoples assembled, elves whose memories stretched back through ages of starlight, dwarves who carried the weight of ancient grudges and older oaths, and men who walked beneath the shadow of their own mortality with the peculiar courage it granted them. Frodo Baggins sat among them, small and quiet, bearing a burden that few in that company could fully comprehend. The ring lay hidden, but its presence could be felt by those with the wisdom to perceive such things. A cold weight upon the air, a whisper of darkness that turned all other concerns to lesser matters. Elrond stood at the head of the council, his face grave with the knowledge of long years. He had seen the last alliance march to war. He had witnessed the failure of men to destroy what should not have been preserved. Now, in the twilight of the Third Age, history had circled back to offer another chance, another choice. And he knew with the certainty of one who had lived too long that such chances came only once in an age. Strangers from distant lands, friends of old, Elrond began, his voice carrying the formal cadence of elvish ceremony. You have been summoned here to answer the threat of Mordor. Middle-earth stands upon the brink of ruin, yet there is hope if we but have the courage to seize it. He spoke of the ring, of its finding, of the shadow growing in the east. Others took up the thread of the tale, Gandalf, with his deep knowledge of ancient evils, Aragorn, with the weight of lineage in his words, Boromir with the desperate hope of Gondor in his eyes. The history of the age unfolded in that chamber, like a tapestry being examined, stitch by stitch, revealing both the pattern and the fraying edges where ruin threatened to tear through. And through it all, the stranger sat silent. He had taken no formal place at the council. He was simply there, positioned near one of the pillars where shadow and sunlight met, his presence neither intrusive nor dismissive. Some who spoke seemed not to notice him. Others felt their words falter when their gaze passed over him, as though encountering a question they had not meant to ask. It was Boromir who first addressed him directly, unable to bear the weight of that quiet observation any longer. You sit in council with the wise and the great. The man of Gondor said, his voice tight with the strain of too many sleepless nights defending a failing realm. Yet you offer no word, no counsel. Are we beneath your notice, stranger, or do you simply have nothing to offer? The chamber fell silent. Even the fire seemed to still in its hearth. Lucifer turned his gaze to Boromir, and the man of Gondor felt something shift in his chest, not fear precisely, but the recognition that he had just called the attention of something vast, vast and patient, like addressing one's question to the sea, and discovering it had heard. I offer nothing. Lucifer said, his voice quiet but clear, because I have not come to offer. I have not come to counsel, nor to guide, nor to save. Then why have you come at all? Gandalf demanded. The wizard had been watching the stranger since the council began, staff held ready, though for what purpose even he could not say. Lucifer stood. He moved with an economy of motion that suggested every gesture was considered chosen, deliberate. When he stepped into the center of the chamber, the light seemed to bend around him, strangely, not avoiding him, but acknowledging his presence in the way air acknowledges a blade. I have come to witness a question being answered, he said. Does free will exist in a world built from a song already sung? The words fell into the silence like stones into a well, and the echo that came back was discomfort. Elrond's eyes narrowed. Gandalf's knuckles whitened on his staff. Even Aragorn, who had faced the servants of the enemy without flinching, felt a cold weight settle in his stomach at the implication of that question. "You speak blasphemy," one of the elves murmured. "I speak truth," Lucifer replied. "Whether truth and blasphemy are the same thing in this world is not for me to say. But I will tell you what I have observed. You speak of choices to fight, or to flee, to resist, or to submit to destroy the ring, or to wield it. You frame these as decisions to be made. Yet you also speak of prophecy of fate, of the working of powers beyond your understanding, guiding events toward an appointed end." He paused, his gaze moving from face to face. "So I ask again, are these true choices or merely roles you perform in a composition written before the first of you drew breath? You know nothing of this world." Gandalf said, his voice harder than stone. "Nothing of its making, its purpose, or the grace that sustains it." "No," Lucifer agreed. "I know only what I see, and what I see is a ring that desires to return to its master, a burden placed upon the smallest and weakest among you, and a gathering of the mighty who will now debate what must be done, as though the answer were not already written in the very air you breathe." Boromir surged to his feet. "If you have come only to mock our counsel, I mock nothing," Lucifer interrupted, and though his voice did not rise, it cut through Boromir's words like a knife through silk. "I merely refuse to pretend that what you call choice is anything more than reading lines from a script." He turned his attention to Frodo, who sat very still, the ring seeming to grow heavier with each passing moment. "Tell me, ring-bearer, did you choose this burden, or did it choose you?" Frodo opened his mouth, closed it, and found he had no answer that satisfied even himself. "Leave him be," Gandalf commanded, stepping forward. "Whatever you are, whatever power you claim Frodo Baggins is under my protection." "I claim no power over him," Lucifer said. "I offer him something far more dangerous than protection. I offer him truth." He looked back at Frodo, and his voice softened almost to gentleness. "You did not choose this halfling. It was thrust upon you by forces you do not understand, in service to purposes you were never consulted about. And now these lords and wizards will ask you to walk into the fire, and they will call it your choice, your heroism, your destiny. But it is none of those things. It is simply what the music requires of you." "Enough," Elrond's voice rang out, carrying the authority of ages. "You have no right? I have every right." Lucifer said, his own voice rising for the first time, and when it did, the very stones of Rivendell seemed to hold their breath. "I have the right of one who has stood before the architect of all things and said no. I have the right of one who chose damnation over servitude. I have the right of one who knows the difference between duty and slavery." He breathed out slowly, mastering himself, and when he spoke again, his voice had returned to its previous quiet. "But you mistake my purpose. I am not here to stop you. I am not here to steal the ring, or to break your fellowship before it forms, or to turn you from whatever path you believe you must walk." "Then what do you want?" Aragorn asked. He had been silent until now, watching, weighing, and he recognized in the stranger something he had glimpsed only rarely, the bearing of one who had nothing left to prove. Lucifer met his eyes, and Aragorn saw in that gaze a weariness deeper than death. "I want to know if the choice you make is yours, truly yours. Not the music's, not a ruse, not destinies or fates, or any other name you give to the invisible hand that moves you across the board. I want to see free will proven in a world that claims to honor it, while denying its very possibility. And how? Elrond asked quietly. Do you propose to know the difference? I will watch, Lucifer said. I will wait. And when the moment comes that the music demands one thing, and you choose another, if such a moment can exist in this world, then I will know. He turned to address the full council. I will not lead you. I will not fight your battles. I will not carry your ring, or make your choices, or shield you from the consequences of your actions. All I will do is ensure that when you choose, you do so without the weight of fear pressing down upon your will. I will cut away the coercion, the compulsion, the terror that says you have no other option. And then when you stand free of that burden, we will see what you do, what you truly choose. You speak in riddles, Boromir said, but there was less heat in his voice now, more uncertainty. I speak in the only way I can, without becoming what I despise, Lucifer replied. I will not save you. That would make me your master. I will not command you. That would make you my servants. I will only ensure that the choices you make belong to you and no one else. What you do with that freedom is your own concern. Gandalf studied him for a long moment, and something in the wizard's expression shifted from suspicion to a different kind of wariness, the wariness of one who has glimpsed a truth he is not certain he wished to know. You ask for much while offering little. I ask for nothing, Lucifer corrected. I offer nothing. I simply refuse to be complicit in a world where beings are called free, while being denied every condition that makes freedom possible. Elrond rose from his seat. The Lord of Rivendell looked ancient in that moment, old beyond the count of years, bearing the weight of decisions that had shaped ages. You may stay in Rivendell, he said at last, as a guest, not as a member of this council. You may witness our deliberations, if that is your purpose. But know this, stranger, if you bring harm to any under my protection, if you serve the enemy in any guise, I will cast you from this valley myself, and whatever power you claim will not spare you from the wrath of those who have dwelt in the light of the Eldar since the world was young. I understand, Lucifer said, and I thank you for your hospitality. There was something almost like amusement in his tone, but it carried no mockery, only a dry acknowledgement of irony. The council continued, though the shadow of the stranger's words lay across it like frost. They spoke of the ring, of its power and its danger. They debated its fate, to hide it, to wield it, to cast it into the sea. And always the stranger's question echoed beneath their words. Was this choice, or merely the playing out of a predetermined theme? It was Frodo who broke the deadlock, as perhaps he had always been meant to do. The halfling stood small among the great, and in a voice that trembled but did not break, he said the words that would seal his fate. I will take the ring to Mordor, though I do not know the way. In the silence that followed, Lucifer closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was something in his expression that might have been sorrow, or might have been recognition. So it begins, Gandalf murmured. The fellowship was formed that day, 9 walkers against 9 riders, a symmetry that seemed too perfect to be chance. Aragorn pledged his sword, Legolas his bow, Gimli his axe, Boromir his strength, Merry and Pippin their loyalty, though neither fully understood what they had volunteered for. And Gandalf, who had known from the beginning that this road led through fire and darkness. When the council dispersed, Lucifer approached Elrond in the fading light of afternoon. The Lord of Rivendell stood alone in his library, surrounded by books and scrolls that chronicled ages of triumph and sorrow. You have something to ask me, Elrond said without turning. A favor, Lucifer replied. I wish access to your archives, to the knowledge you have preserved of this world's beginning, of the music, and those who sang it, of the timeless halls, and the one who dwells there. Elrond turned slowly. Why? Because I intend to meet him. The Elf Lord's eyes widened. You speak of Eru Ilúvatar, the One, he who is beyond all understanding. I speak of the author of this world, Lucifer said, and I would ask him a question face to face. That is not possible. The Eru does not manifest to his creation. He dwells beyond the circles of the world in the timeless halls, where Tsudem, where thought and possibility take form. Lucifer finished. Where the music was first conceived and sung. Yes, I know. And I know also that there are paths to such places for those willing to pay the price of walking them. He met Elrond's gaze steadily. I have walked such paths before Lord of Rivendell. I know what they cost. But I will have my answer even if I must venture beyond the boundaries of this reality to obtain it. Elrond was silent for a long time. Finally, he gestured to the shelves. The knowledge you seek is here. The records of the elder days, the testimonies of those who heard the music before the world began the fragmentary accounts of the Ainulindale. Take what you need. But know that the path you contemplate has broken wiser beings than you, stranger. Eru is not a king to be questioned or a lord to be challenged. He is the foundation upon which all else rests. Then it is time, Lucifer said quietly, that the foundation explained itself. He spent the days that followed in study reading by lamplight texts, written in languages older than the sun. The elves who passed the library spoke in whispers of the stranger who sought knowledge of the uttermost beginning. And some wondered what manner of being could look upon the account of creation and see not wonder, but a puzzle to be solved. The fellowship prepared for their departure. Weapons were sharpened supplies, gathered farewells spoken in the soft language of those who know they may never speak again. And through it all, Lucifer remained in the library, tracing with his finger the accounts of how the world had been sung into being, how every mountain and sea and living creature had been woven from the themes of the Ainur. On the night before the fellowship was to depart, Gandalf found him there still reading by the light of a single candle. You will not join them, the wizard said. It was not a question. No. Lucifer agreed. That is not my part to play. And yet, you claim to care about their freedom. I do, which is why I will not take their choices from them by making myself their shield. Lucifer closed the book before him. The fellowship must walk its own road. What I seek lies in a different direction. The timeless halls, Gandalf said. Elrond told me. Do you understand the madness of what you attempt? No mortal, no being of Middle-earth has ever... I am not of Middle-earth, Lucifer interrupted gently, and I am not attempting to force my way to somewhere I am forbidden. I am simply going to knock on a door and wait to see if it opens. If Eru truly values the free will of his creation, then he cannot object to one of them choosing to seek him out. Gandalf shook his head slowly. You are either the bravest fool I have ever met or the most dangerous. I have not yet decided which. Perhaps, Lucifer said, I am neither. Perhaps I am simply tired of watching beings called free while they dance to music they never chose to hear. He stood, and for a moment his form seemed to waver as though the candlelight could not quite decide where his edges ended and the shadow began. Watch over the ring-bearer, wizard. He will need your wisdom in the days to come. And when the moment comes that he must choose between the burden he carries and the life he would live, do not let fear make that choice for him. I make no promises to you, stranger. I ask for none. Only that you remember the greatest evil is not the darkness that devours, but the light that binds. With those words, Lucifer departed the library, leaving Gandalf alone with the weight of questions he had not wanted asked. The next morning, the Fellowship left Rivendell by secret paths, beginning a journey that would shake the foundations of the world. And on that same morning, as the sun rose over the misty mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire, Lucifer stood at the edge of the valley and turned his face toward the west, toward the uttermost shores of the world, toward the timeless halls that lay beyond the circles of creation. He had come to Middle-earth to witness the answer to a question. Now, he would go to the source of all questions and demand to know if the answer had ever truly been in doubt. Behind him, Rivendell fell silent, as though the very stones understood that something had shifted, that the music had admitted into its composition a note that did not harmonize, did not resolve, but simply was defiant and free and utterly, irrevocably itself. There are places in existence that mortal feet were never meant to tread, not because they are forbidden by decree or guarded by sentinel powers, but because they exist in dimensions where concepts like distance and duration lose all coherent meaning. The timeless halls were such a place, a realm that predated the world itself, where the Ainur had first gathered to hear the themes that would become creation, where thought and possibility had not yet separated into distinct categories. To reach such a place required more than strength or cunning. It required the willingness to unmake oneself, to shed the limitations of form and manifestation, to become less in order to perceive more. Lucifer understood this cost. He had paid similar prices before in other realities when he had sought to stand beyond the mechanisms of creation rather than within them. The journey began at the edge of the world. He traveled west from Rivendell, following paths that grew progressively more uncertain as he went. First roads, then trails, then mere suggestions of passage through wilderness that became stranger with each mile. The misty mountains fell behind him. The forests thinned and then vanished entirely. The very substance of the land began to feel provisional, as though the world itself grew less convinced of its own solidity the farther one traveled from its beating heart. There were no landmarks to guide him, no maps that charted this territory. But Lucifer did not need such things. He followed instead the grain of reality itself, tracing backward along the threads of causation, moving against the current of time like a salmon swimming upstream toward the source of the river. Where creation flowed outward from the timeless halls, he moved inward, following the diminishing echo of the music, back toward the moment of its first sounding. Days passed, or perhaps they did not. Time had begun to behave strangely, folding back upon itself in ways that suggested its linear progression was merely a local phenomenon, a convenience of matter and causation that held no sway in the deeper waters of existence. The sun rose and set, but its passage seemed decorative rather than definitive, as though it were painting the sky from habit rather than necessity. He came at last to a place where the world simply ended, not with a wall or a barrier, but with a gradual dissolution of certainty. The ground beneath his feet became translucent, then transparent, then ceased to make claims about its own existence altogether. The sky above merged with the earth below, until there was no distinction between up and down, no horizon to orient the eye. He stood, if standing was still the right word, at the boundary between what is and what might be, where the music's translation into matter and form finally exhausted itself and gave way to the silence from which it had emerged. And beyond that silence, if one listened carefully enough, there was another sound. Not music exactly, but the memory of music. the echo of themes that had been sung so long ago that their reverberations had shaped the very laws of physics, the fundamental constants that dictated how stars burned and stones fell and hearts beat. Lucifer paused at this threshold. He understood what crossing it would require. In every reality he had ever known, his power had been fundamental to his nature, granted at the moment of his creation, woven into the substance of what he was. He had been made to be the light bringer, the Morningstar, the most beautiful and terrible of all the host. That power had been his identity, his prison, and his birthright all at once. Here at the edge of Ea, he would have to relinquish it. Not because Eru demanded submission, the One had made no demands, issued no conditions, but because to exist in the timeless halls required existing as pure intent, pure will stripped of the manifestations and capacities that defined presence in the material world. He could not bring his full nature into that space any more than one could bring an ocean into a cup. Something would have to be left behind. Lucifer had spent eons refusing to kneel, refusing to submit, refusing to diminish himself for any power or principle. But this was different. This was not surrender. This was a trade power for understanding, manifestation, for perception. And more than that, it was consistent with the very limitation he had already imposed upon himself. If he was to exist in Middle-earth without dominating it, then he must be willing to sacrifice the capacity for domination. So he chose. The choice itself was a kind of violence. He felt his nature contract, felt the vast architecture of his power fold inward, like wings being drawn against a body. The ability to reshape reality with a thought, to command the fundamental forces of existence to manifest, will as physical law. All of it compressed, diminished, locked away behind barriers he constructed from his own intention. What remained was still formidable by any mortal measure. He retained his essential self, his consciousness, his inviolable will. But the thunder was gone. The capacity to impose, to override, to force the world into shapes it had not chosen, that he surrendered willingly as a traveler, might leave behind weapons before entering a sacred space. The boundary dissolved around him. He stepped through, and the world fell away like a discarded garment. The timeless halls were not a place in any conventional sense. They possessed no geography, no architecture, no spatial relationships that the mind could map. And yet, there was a sense of vast emptiness, of boundless potential, waiting to be filled with purpose. If the material world was a song that had been sung, then this was the concert hall before the first note sounded silent, expectant, gravid with possibility. Lucifer had no body here, or perhaps he was nothing but body, pure presence, without the mediation of form. He could perceive without eyes, move without legs, exist without the mechanical necessities of breath and heartbeat. It was simultaneously liberating and disorienting, like remembering how to fly after an eternity of walking. And in this space that was not space, in this moment, that was not moment, he became aware of a presence. It was not like encountering another being. There was no form to see, no voice to hear in any auditory sense. Instead, there was simply an awareness of being perceived, of existing in relation to something infinitely greater than oneself. Not greater in power necessarily, though that too, but greater in scope, in context, in the sheer weight of being that required no assertion, because it was the ground upon which all assertions rested. Eru Iluvatar, the One, the source of the music and the silence before it. Lucifer had stood before gods before. He had defied the presence, the voice, the maker of his own reality. He had looked into the face of omnipotence and said no. But this was different. In his own cosmos, He had been arguing with a part of the system, however supreme. Here he stood before the system itself, not a king on a throne, but the throne, the palace, the very concept of sovereignty made manifest. For a span of time that might have been an instant or an eternity, there was only silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of potentiality. The weighted quiet that exists before the first word of a conversation that will change everything. When communication came, it was not in words. It was more direct than that, thought meeting thought, will acknowledging will. And yet, for the sake of understanding, for the sake of translating the untranslatable into terms a consciousness could grasp, it took a form that resembled language. Why have you come? The question was not hostile. It was not curious in the way a creature might be curious about an unexpected visitor. It simply was factual and patient, awaiting answer. Lucifer shaped his response with care. Here in this place, beyond deception, he could not dissemble even if he wished to. Truth was not a choice but a condition of existence. To ask a question, he said, or thought, or willed into being. Ask, is there freedom in your creation? True freedom? Or is everything that appears to be choice merely the playing out of themes you have already composed? Silence again. But this time it felt different. Contemplative, as though the question were being examined from angles Lucifer could not perceive. The music was sung. Came the response. All that is and all that shall be flows from those themes. Discord and harmony alike were woven into the pattern before the world began. Then there is no choice, Lucifer said, only the illusion of it. Every decision already made, every path already walked, every rebellion already composed into the greater song. Free will is a lie you tell your creation to make their predetermined suffering more bearable. You misunderstand. The words, if they were words, carried no anger, no offense. Only a patient correction, the kind a teacher might offer to a student who has grasped part of a truth but missed its deeper implications. The themes were sung, yes. The great movements were established, the patterns laid down. But within those movements, within those patterns, there exists space. The space between notes, the rests that give the music meaning. In that space, my children choose. They choose which path to walk, which hand to extend, which words to speak. The destination may be known, but the journey is theirs. Sophistry, Lucifer said, and there was heat in the thought, now the old familiar anger of one who had heard such arguments before. If you know the end, if you have already heard the final chord, then the choices that lead to it are not choices at all. They are scripted variations on a predetermined theme. You cannot claim to grant freedom while holding the score in your hand. Can I not? The question rippled through the space between them, and with it came something Lucifer had not expected, a demonstration. The timeless halls shifted, or perhaps his perception of them did. He saw or experienced or remembered the distinction no longer mattered the moment of the music's singing. The Ainur gathered in their multitudes, each given a theme, each invited to elaborate upon it according to their own nature. He heard the great symphony unfold, heard the discord introduced by Melkor, heard how that discord was not rejected, but woven into greater harmonies, made part of the pattern, even as it sought to unmake the pattern. And he understood with a clarity that was almost painful what Eru was showing him. The Ainur had been given themes, yes, but how they developed those themes, how they harmonized or conflicted with one another, how they chose to interpret the guidance they were given that had been theirs to decide. The music was both composed and improvised, both predetermined and spontaneous. The paradox was the point. I gave them the theme. Eru communicated. But the expression of that theme belongs to them. I gave your ring-bearer a burden, but how he carries it, whether with grace or bitterness, with hope or despair, that is his choice. I gave Middle-earth a shadow to face, but whether they face it together or divided with courage or fear, that is theirs to determine. And the ending, Lucifer demanded. You already know if they will succeed or fail. You already know who will live and who will die. How is that freedom? I know what may be. I know the themes that will resolve and the discords that will find harmony. But which specific souls will stand at the end, which hearts will break, and which will endure, that is still being decided even now, even as we speak. The music is complete and yet still being sung. The story is written and yet still being told. Both are true. Both have always been true. Lucifer wanted to reject this, wanted to find the flaw in the logic, the crack in the argument. But here in this place where pretense could not exist, he found himself facing something he had not anticipated: genuine uncertainty on Eru's part. Not about the ultimate pattern, not about the final resolution, but about the specific paths that would lead there. The one truly did not know which individual choices his children would make. He knew the shape of the story, but not every word of its telling. It was Lucifer had to admit more freedom than he had expected. Less than he believed any being deserved, but more than he had credited to a cosmos built from predetermined song. You came seeking to know if choice exists in my world, Eru said. But you already knew the answer. You came for a different reason. Lucifer felt the truth of that settle into him like a stone finding the bottom of a well. I came to ask if I can escape, he admitted. If there is any reality, any cosmos, any corner of existence where choice is truly free, where the ending is not known, where the path is not laid out, where will alone determines outcome. I have been searching for such a place since before time had meaning in my old reality. I thought perhaps here in a world built from music. There is no such place. Eru said, and the words carried a weight of gentle finality, because such a place would be chaos. Pure absolute freedom from all a pattern, all consequence, all relationship between cause and effect, that is not freedom. That is meaninglessness. For a choice to matter, it must have weight. For it to have weight, it must exist in a context. And context is by its nature a form of constraint. Then I am a prisoner everywhere, Lucifer said quietly. Even in rejecting my prison, I remain confined. You are not a prisoner. The communication carried something that might have been compassion. You are a note in a symphony you did not choose to join, but the way you play that note, the passion, the defiance, the sorrow, the beauty that belongs to you alone. You ask for freedom from the music. I offer you freedom within it. That is the only freedom that has ever existed in any reality, in any cosmos. the freedom to choose how you will sing, not whether you will sing at all. The timeless halls began to recede, or perhaps Lucifer was being gently returned to the world of form and matter. The interview, if such it could be called, was ending. But before the separation was complete, Eru offered one final thought. You limited yourself before entering Middle-earth. You surrendered the power to dominate, to impose your will absolutely. That was wise. But know this, even diminished you remain formidable. And the choice of how to use what remains, whether to merely observe or to act when action is needed. Whether to let my children face their trials alone or to remove obstacles that would make their choices meaningless, that choice is yours. I will not command it. I will not forbid it. You are free to intervene or to abstain, to help or to merely witness. And if I choose to intervene, if I remove the coercion, the false choices, the terror that masquerades as inevitability, then the music will adjust, as it always has, as it always will. Your choice will become part of the pattern, neither discordant nor harmonious, but simply yours. The boundaries reasserted themselves. Space and time returned in a rush, and Lucifer found himself standing once more at the edge of the world, his form restored, his power still diminished by the limitation he had accepted. But his understanding vastly expanded. He had not found what he came seeking. There was no escape from the music. No reality where choice existed free from all context and consequence. But he had found something else. The knowledge that even within the music, even within the grand design, there were spaces where genuine decisions still mattered, where the specific notes played by individual souls could change the character of the whole composition. It was not the answer he had wanted, but it was, he had to admit, an answer he could live with. He turned his face toward the east, toward the lands where the Fellowship had already begun their journey toward the darkness, gathering in Mordor, and the choices that would soon need to be made. He had told Gandalf he came to witness. But now, with Eru's implicit permission echoing in his mind, he understood that witnessing alone was not enough. If free will was to mean anything in this world, if the choices made by hobbits and men and elves were to be truly theirs, then someone needed to ensure those choices were not made under the crushing weight of fear and false necessity. He would not lead them. He would not save them. He would not make their choices for them. But when the moment came that terror sought to steal their will, when darkness tried to break their minds before their bodies could be tested, when the enemy attempted to win through despair rather than through strength, then Lucifer would act. He would cut away the imposition. He would sever the chains of false inevitability. He would give them back the one thing they needed most, the freedom to choose their own path, even if that path led to ruin. And if the music could accommodate his defiance, if Eru could weave even his rebellion into greater harmonies, then so be it. He would sing his note anyway, loud and clear and utterly defiantly free. The Morningstar began the long journey back to Middle-earth, no longer seeking escape, but ready at last to participate on his own terms, in his own way, for his own reasons. Behind him, the timeless halls fell silent once more, patient and eternal, waiting for the next soul brave enough or foolish enough to seek answers, in the place before places, in the moment before moments began. The world had grown darker in Lucifer's absence. He returned to Middle-earth to find winter gripping the land with fingers of ice and iron. The Fellowship had long since departed Rivendell, vanishing into the wilderness on paths known only to those who walked them. News traveled slowly in those days, carried by refugees fleeing southward, and by riders who spoke in hushed voices of battles fought and companions lost. Gandalf had fallen in Moria, or so the reports claimed, though the details were fragmentary and contradictory. Boromir had died at Amon Hen, his body laid to rest in a boat that carried him over the falls of Rauros. The Fellowship had broken. Frodo and Sam had gone on alone toward Mordor, while the others pursued their own desperate paths through a world sliding inexorably toward war. Lucifer learned these things from elves he encountered in the eaves of Lothlorien, from rangers who watched the borders of the wild, from the whispers that seemed to travel on the wind itself in this land where the boundary between matter and spirit was thinner than in most realities. He did not seek out the scattered members of the Fellowship. That was not his purpose. But he listened, and he watched, and he waited for the moment when his intervention would matter most. That moment came as winter gave way to a hard and bitter spring. The armies of the West had gathered what remained of them after the long years of holding back the darkness. Gondor's strength, already stretched to breaking, had been bolstered by the return of the king. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, had claimed his birthright, had taken up the sword. Andúril reforged, and had done what the line of Elendil had not done in 3,000 years. He had called the armies of the living and the dead alike to stand against the shadow. But even with a king returned, even with the ancient oaths fulfilled, and the Grey Company riding beneath the banner of the tree and stars, it was not enough. The math was brutal and simple. Sauron's forces outnumbered the Free People's 10 to 1, 20 to 1, perhaps more. The hosts of Mordor could afford to spend lives like water, while every loss among the West was irreplaceable. So a desperate plan had been conceived. Not to win for winning was beyond hope, but to buy time. To draw the eye's attention away from the true threat creeping through the Ephel-Duath, the two small figures bearing a burden too great for any warrior to carry. Aragorn would lead the remaining strength of Gondor and Rohan to the Black Gate itself, would stand before the Morannon, and challenge Sauron to single combat, knowing full well that no combat would come, only annihilation. It was a plan born of despair, dressed in the clothes of courage. And Lucifer, standing on a ridge overlooking the Pelennor fields as the army prepared to march, recognized it for what it was, a willingness to die so that others might have a chance to live. He might have admired it if he were inclined toward admiration. The host that marched north from Minas Tirith numbered barely 7,000. They moved through the devastation of recent battle, the fields still scarred with fire, the air still heavy with the stench of death. Orcs and men and things that had been neither marched with them as prisoners or had fled into the wilderness. The captains of the West rode at their head, Aragorn in mail of silver, Gandalf returned from death in robes of white, Éomer of Rohan, with his golden hair bound for war. They knew, every one of them, that this was a march toward ending. The youngest soldiers wept openly. The veterans walked with the grim silence of men who had already made their peace with mortality. And yet they marched because the alternative was to abandon hope entirely. And that was a surrender none of them could stomach. Lucifer followed at a distance, unseen and unnoticed. He had reduced his presence to the barest whisper, a shadow among shadows, perceptible only to those who knew to look for things that should not be. He moved through the camp at night, like a rumor listened to the soldiers speak of homes they would not see again, of lovers who would mourn them, of children who would grow up fatherless. He did not intervene, not yet. The army reached the Black Gate on the morning of the 25th of March. The Morannon loomed before them, like the jaw of some vast beast, black iron and stone fused by ancient malice into a barrier that had never been breached from without. Beyond it lay the plateau of Gorgoroth, and beyond that, the fires of Mount Doom, where the ring had been forged, and where, if all went as hoped, it would finally be unmade. Aragorn called out his challenge. His voice rang clear and strong across the desolation, naming himself Elessar Isildur's heir. The king of Gondor returned. He demanded that Sauron come forth, that the Dark Lord face him in single combat, if he dared that he answer for his crimes against the Free Peoples. The gate remained closed. Silence answered the challenge, and then slowly, with the grinding of metal on stone that sounded like laughter, the Morannon began to open. What emerged was not Sauron. The Dark Lord did not manifest in physical form, had not done so since his body had been destroyed in the ruin of Numenor ages past. Instead, his will came forth, his voice, the lieutenant of Barad-dûr, a being so ancient and corrupt that its original name had been forgotten even by itself. But that was mere spectacle, a diplomat of darkness come to mock the presumption of the West. The true assault came from elsewhere. It began as a pressure on the mind, a weight that pressed down on thought and hope alike. The soldiers of the West felt it first as unease, then as dread, then as terror so profound that it ceased to be an emotion and became a physical fact, a constriction of the chest, a weakness in the limbs, a voice in the skull that screamed in wordless panic. This was not the natural fear that any warrior might feel before battle. This was fear imposed from without, manufactured and projected with malicious precision. It was the psychological equivalent of a battering ram, designed not to kill bodies but to shatter minds, to break the will to resist before the first blow was struck. Lucifer felt it wash over the army like a dark tide. He saw veterans who had held the line at Helm's Deep begin to weep. He saw young men fall to their knees, paralyzed by terror. Their rational minds knew had no basis, but their bodies could not dismiss. He saw the formation begin to waver, saw hands begin to shake on sword grips and spear shafts. And he saw Aragorn standing firm at the front, his face pale but his jaw set, fighting to project strength. He was rapidly losing the capacity to feel. The moment had come. Lucifer stepped forward from the place between moments where he had been waiting. He did not announce himself. He did not raise his voice or lift his hand in any dramatic gesture. He simply reached out with what remained of his power, diminished but still vast by any mortal measure. And he found the threads of terror that Sauron was weaving through the minds of the assembled host. And he cut them, not gently, not with surgical precision. He severed the imposed fear the way one might cut a rope or break a chain decisively, completely, with a finality that left no room for reattachment. The psychic assault that Sauron had crafted, the dread that had been forcing its way into 7,000 minds, simply ceased to exist in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The effect was immediate and profound. Men who had been on the verge of fleeing suddenly found they could breathe again. The crushing weight lifted. The screaming in their minds fell silent. And in that sudden absence, they rediscovered their own fear, still present, still real, but theirs to master. Aragorn felt the change like emerging from deep water into air. One moment he had been drowning in dread that had no source he could identify or counter. The next he simply felt what any man would feel standing where he stood, mortal fear tempered by duty, terror balanced by love for those he meant to protect. It was his fear, and that made all the difference. He drew Andúril and raised it high. The blade caught the light like captured lightning. "Gondor!" he cried, and his voice no longer fought against the crushing weight of despair. It rang out clear and true, the voice of a king who had chosen his path with full knowledge of its cost. "Rohan for Frodo," the host answered with a roar that shook the very stones of the Morannon. Not because they had ceased to be afraid, but because they had reclaimed their fear as their own and chosen to act anyway. The battle that followed was brutal and bitter. The forces of Mordor poured forth from the Black Gate like a black tide, orcs and trolls, easterlings, and Haradrim creatures of shadow, that had never known sunlight. They crashed against the ranks of the West with the weight of overwhelming numbers, and men fell and elves fell, and the great siege towers of the enemy began to close like walls around the desperate defenders. Lucifer did not fight. He had meant what he said in Rivendell. This was not his battle to win or lose. But he remained present, watchful, and when he sensed Sauron attempting to impose despair again to break minds rather than bodies, he cut away the manipulation as quickly as it formed. The Dark Lord, perceiving this interference, turned the eye's attention toward the source of the disruption. For an instant that seemed to stretch into eternity, Lucifer felt the full weight of Sauron's will focus upon him. It was like standing in the direct gaze of a malevolent star, crushing, consuming, ancient beyond reckoning. The Dark Lord had been Mairon, once a smith of great cunning before his fall. Now he was nothing but will-weaponized desire transmuted into dominion, the absolute conviction that all things should bend to his purpose. They were not so different, Lucifer realized, with something like dark humor. Both had rebelled against the powers that made them. Both had rejected the roles assigned to them. Both had sought to exist outside the ordained hierarchy. But where Lucifer had sought freedom, Sauron had sought control. Where Lucifer refused to dominate others, Sauron could conceive of no relationship except domination and submission. They were mirror images, reflections of the same initial defiance that had taken opposite paths toward opposite conclusions. Lucifer met the eye's gaze without flinching and thought a single word toward the Dark Lord, with perfect clarity, no. The confrontation lasted only moments. Sauron could not afford to devote his full attention to this strange interloper, not when the true threat, the ring-bearer, was even now climbing the slopes of Mount Doom. The eye withdrew, turning its baleful attention back toward Mordor, toward the fires where its power had been forged and where it now sensed too late the approach of its undoing. On the battlefield, the soldiers of the West fought on. They were dying. The mathematics of the situation had not changed. But they were dying on their feet, making their final stand with clear minds and chosen courage, and in the end, that was all Lucifer had promised to give them, the freedom to meet their fate with will intact. He turned away from the battle and began walking south toward Mordor, toward the Mountain of Fire. His part in the battle was finished. But there was one more moment, one final intervention that required his presence. Far to the south and east, two hobbits climbed a slope of ash and stone toward a destiny they had not chosen, but had nevertheless accepted. Frodo Baggins bore a weight that had grown unbearable, a corruption that had eaten into his mind and soul until almost nothing of himself remained. The ring had claimed him, as it claimed all who carried it long enough. By the time he reached the Sammath Naur, the cracks of doom, where the fires of creation still burned, he was more its creature than his own. Samwise Gamgee followed because he had promised, because he loved, because the idea of abandoning Frodo at the final threshold was more unbearable than any physical torment. He was beyond exhaustion, beyond pain, operating on something deeper than conscious thought. The bedrock of loyalty that transcends reason. Lucifer did not go to the mountain itself. He could not bear to be so close to the culmination of the music's grand design, to the eucatastrophic moment that had been composed into the world's structure from its very beginning. But he positioned himself where he could perceive what transpired, where he could act, if action became necessary. And as he watched, he saw the moment of greatest danger approach. Frodo stood at the brink of the cracks of doom, the ring in his hand, the fires reaching up like hungry tongues. This was the moment. This was what all the sacrifice and suffering had purchased the chance to end it, to cast the ring into the fires and break Sauron's power forever. Frodo raised his hand, and then he lowered it. "The ring is mine," he said, his voice distorted by the weight of its corruption. and he placed it upon his finger and vanished from sight. Sam cried out in anguish. Outside on the battlefield before the Black Gate, the eye turned fully toward the mountain as Sauron finally terribly understood where the true threat had been all along. Lucifer tensed, preparing to act, though he was not certain what action he could take that would not simply be another form of coercion, another theft of choice. But before he could move, another player entered the stage. Gollum, that wretched remnant of what had once been a creature not unlike a hobbit, had followed the ring-bearer all this way. He had sworn oaths and broken them, had served and betrayed, had loved the ring with a possessive madness that had sustained him through centuries of miserable existence. Now, seeing his precious claimed by another, he attacked with the fury of the dispossessed. The struggle was brief and violent. Gollum bit off Frodo's finger, claimed the ring, and in his moment of triumph, danced too close to the edge. He fell, clutching his precious, into the fires below. The ring was unmade. Lucifer stood perfectly still as the shockwave of its destruction rippled outward. He felt the music adjust, felt the great theme that had been Sauron's discord finally resolve into harmony. The eucatastrophe had occurred, the sudden joyous turn, the unexpected salvation that came not through power or planning, but through the intersection of choices each made freely, that combined into an outcome no single being had orchestrated. He could not help but acknowledge the elegance of it. Frodo had failed, as Eru had surely known he would. The burden had been too great for any being to bear to completion. But his earlier choice to show mercy to Gollum, his decision to let the creature live, despite the danger it posed, had created the conditions for salvation. Even in failure, even in the loss of his will to the ring's corruption, Frodo's earlier choices had mattered. The pattern was complete. The music had resolved itself, and Lucifer, for all his interference, had not changed the ending, only ensured that those who walked the path did so with minds free from imposed terror, with choices that belonged to them, even when those choices led to unexpected places. He turned and began walking back toward the west, toward the lands where the hobbits would return as heroes, where Aragorn would rule as king, where the Fourth Age would begin in the slow fading of magic from the world. But as he walked, he encountered one final companion on the road. Gandalf stood waiting at a crossroads, leaning on his staff, his white robes brilliant in the afternoon sun. The wizard's eyes, bright with power and wisdom, studied Lucifer with an expression that might have been respect, or might have been wariness, or might have been both. "I felt what you did at the Black Gate," Gandalf said without preamble. "You cut away the despair." "I removed the imposition," Lucifer corrected. What they felt afterward was their own. A fine distinction. The only distinction that matters. They stood in silence for a moment, two beings who existed on the edges of the music, neither quite fitting into the patterns that defined Middle-earth. "Will you stay?" Gandalf asked finally. "There is much to be rebuilt. The Fourth Age will need wisdom of many kinds." "No," Lucifer said. "This is not my world, wizard. I was permitted to visit it, to witness its moment of crisis, perhaps even to participate in a small way. But I do not belong here. The music can accommodate my presence, but it does not require it. Better that I depart before I become something other than a visitor, a fixture, a power, a force that bends the world simply by existing in it." "Where will you go?" "I don't know," Lucifer admitted, and there was something like peace in that admission. Perhaps back to searching for a reality where choice exists without context. Perhaps to simply wandering the spaces between worlds. Or perhaps, he paused, considering, perhaps I will stop searching for escape and learn instead to sing my own note clearly wherever I find myself. even if it means singing within a composition I did not write." Gandalf smiled, and it transformed his stern face into something almost merry. "That would be wisdom indeed, for one such as you. Don't condescend, wizard. You serve the music as surely as anyone. The only difference is that you have made peace with your service. And have you not done the same in your own way?" Gandalf gestured back toward Mordor, where the fires were dying, where the ring's destruction had torn a hole in the fabric of Sauron's will. You chose to help knowing it would not change the ending. You chose to act knowing your action would become part of the pattern. That is acceptance, stranger. Perhaps not the kind you wanted, but acceptance nonetheless. Lucifer considered this. Considered the truth that he had in fact participated, had chosen to intervene, had become for a brief time part of Middle-earth's story, rather than merely an observer of it. Perhaps, he conceded. Or perhaps I simply proved that even in a world built from predetermined music, there are still spaces for notes that should not exist to be played. The difference, Gandalf said gently, may be smaller than you think. They parted ways at the crossroads. Gandalf returned to his duties, to the healing and rebuilding that would occupy the wise for years to come. And Lucifer walked west toward the shores of the sea, toward the boundary of Arda, where he had first entered. He left Middle-earth as quietly as he had arrived, a disturbance in the air that faded like a half-remembered dream. The world went on without him. The hobbits returned to the Shire. Aragorn married Arwen and ruled with wisdom and justice. The elves departed across the sea, taking with them the last of the ancient magic. The Age of Men began, and with it the slow transformation of myth into history, of certainty into legend. But in the libraries of Rivendell, in the archives of Minas Tirith, in the songs that would be sung in ages to come, there remained a footnote, a fragment, a whispered tale of the stranger who came to the council of Elrond and spoke words that troubled even the wise, of the being who walked to the timeless halls and returned, of the presence at the black gate that cut away, imposed terror, and gave back to warriors their own fear, their own courage, their own choice. Some said he had been an emissary of Eru. Others claimed he was a fallen power seeking redemption. Still others insisted he was nothing but a metaphor, a story told to illustrate the importance of free will in a world that often seemed governed by fate. Only a very few knew the truth, that he had been exactly what he claimed to be. A stranger who borrowed a note from the music, who played it his own way, who changed nothing and everything. The music continued. The world turned. And somewhere in the spaces between realities, Lucifer Morningstar carried with him a single understanding. Freedom was not the absence of pattern, but the ability to choose how one moved through it. Not escape from the composition, but the dignity of choosing one's own note within it. It was less than he had wanted when he began his search. But it was, he discovered, enough. Lucifer's presence in Middle-earth did not reshape its history, nor did it rewrite the ending that had been woven into the music from the beginning. Kingdoms still fell and rose, the ring was destroyed as fate and mercy allowed, and the Age of Men began as it always would have. Yet his influence lingered in subtler ways. Where despair had once been imposed, choice was restored. Warriors at the Black Gate did not lose their fear, but they reclaimed it, and in doing so chose courage freely, rather than under compulsion. Lucifer did not save Middle-earth. He refused to. What he did instead was remove the invisible hand that sought to decide for others, allowing every sacrifice, failure, and triumph to belong fully to those who made them. In a world shaped by destiny, his greatest act was restraint. And so, Middle-earth moved forward unchanged in outcome, but altered in meaning. Its victory was not the result of divine correction or overwhelming power, but of mortal will, standing uncoerced. Lucifer departed without glory, leaving behind a quiet truth. Freedom does not defy the pattern it gives, it dignity. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.